risk far more than any of us in this room fighting for freedom of expression, and who think of themselves as devout Muslims, and who do a lot to facilitate dialogue. So that I would reject your interpretation of saying Islam is this necessarily, and then we can have a theological debate about what is the correct interpretation, but that doesn't interest me that much.
Okay, Elsa, could you be quick? We want to go party.
Okay, well, it was just, you had said earlier you don't care about these bus ads, pro-Palestinian. I think that there is something about who controls media, who has the money for all the ads and everything, and you're just talking about how people who are anti-abortion may be shut down. You may also be shut down if you want to speak about problems in the Quran or whatever, and you can see this all over. So, and every university across Canada has Israel apartheid thing, and they don't have Saudi Arabia apartheid weeks. And so I think there's a lot more Saudi Arabia apartheid in existence. And I know students, and my God, they're convinced about how horrible Israel is.
Is there a question?
And the thing is, I just would take issue with saying, who the hell cares about that?
Yeah. Can I respond?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Joseph.
Yeah. Okay. At the risk of being a little provocative, if the pro-Israel community of Canada, which is not just the Jewish community, but also there's a very large, very ideologically supportive constituency in the Christian community, evangelical Christian community. If those who support Israel and are exorcised by the bus ads in Vancouver really cared that much, okay, and I'm using that term very loosely, okay, why not put the money together to do their own bus ads? Which, okay, so you see, it's not a question of who has the money or who controls the media. The truth is, on this issue, we have the money and we control the media. And I'm not referring to Jews, okay? As I was saying that, I realized that I might be getting myself into more hot water than I intended. That's right. But seriously, if it's a war of ideas, and I think that this is ultimately, what liberal democracy is all about, competing ideas. We don't share the same ideas, and so our ideas compete with one another, and we have vigorous debate, and hopefully we all participate respectfully and intelligently. But it's messy, and some people are not going to participate with respect, and they're not going to participate with intelligence, and that's the price we pay. That's what democracy is. It's messy. But the problem is that too many of us on our side are now relying on using the blunt instrument of the state in order to shut down the opposition. And I believe we're right and they're wrong with this question, certainly. So what are we afraid of? Engage in the debate. But instead, what we do is we spend a lot of time on silly campaigns trying to stop, different bus companies from running these ads and that. And I go, well, what are we afraid of? We can win this debate or not. But that's democracy, and I'm not prepared. I'm much more afraid, coming from my community, I'm much more afraid of the consequences of throwing away small L liberalism. I'm not a liberal, or maybe I am. I'm a classical liberal. I believe in freedom of speech and freedom of ideas and exchanging ideas. And I think that throwing that tradition away, throwing that tradition under the proverbial bus is far more dangerous. I'd much rather live with a handful of Nazis running around giving their salutes and making whatever trouble they're making, than in a country where a small group of Nazis can seize control over the apparatus of government and then put it into its service. And just very briefly on my idea touching on Nazi Germany, etc. I completely agree with David made as Mr. Kilgore explained, that David says the first step towards his words, the use of words and demonization towards a Holocaust. But the fact there's no empirical evidence whatsoever to suggest that demonization ultimately leads to a Holocaust. There has to be more than that, and I submit that it's actually the acceptance of a culture of repression that has its origins in this whole idea that we don't accept freedom of speech anymore, even if it's for good reasons. And ultimately, the Holocaust, or a Holocaust, would not happen in a liberal democracy where citizens like us will rise up in righteous indignation. I like to think if a government or a party actually did espouse the kinds of things that the Nazis did. The Nazis were not successful because they convinced the majority of Germans. The Nazis were successful because they were able to control what was out in the public square, what was acceptable. And people like you and I were persecuted in that time if we dared to speak out against them. So that's the danger, okay? That's the danger.
Okay, Peter, Terry, just closed at the...
There has been, interestingly, some, I think, interesting division and disagreement among the panelists and among people in the audience and among the audience and panelists. And I think, I'd like to make a little bit of a proposition here, that where these apparent differences emerge, we heard it, I think, and Jacob kept bringing this back to when David would make observations about events in China. Well, in China, it's actually not a democracy, and the laws of gravity operate a little bit differently, right? And similarly, I would make a nuisance of myself by pointing out that it's all very well and good for us in a liberal constitutional democracy to have arguments among and between ourselves and say all sorts of uncharitable things about our various holy men and prophets and so on. But this has global implications. And that, in fact, what we would never in a million years consider incitement to violence, in the content of what we might want to say to one another in our arguments, the function halfway around the world might be horrific violence. So the proposition I would leave everybody with is that what this says to me is that the cause of freedom, human rights, the right to free speech, freedom of association, freedom of conscience, cannot coexist, ultimately, with unfreedom. And that free people cannot coexist with slavery. And that we live in a planet now, on a planet in which we're all very connected with one another. We're all very much, taking from one another's liquor cabinets, whether we want to or not. And that ultimately this question of free speech cannot be resolved on a local or a regional level. That it's going to be, it is a global struggle. And it has to be won globally. It's not a very happy proposition, but I think that's probably sound. That's how I would do it.
Thank you very much. Any other closing comments? We're running late. Jacob, do you want to? Well, thank you very much. I think it was a great debate, discussion. Thank you very much. Join us outside for some food and we can talk about this more privately. Thank you.